Thank you, and for your kind words. I first want to thank Dr. Freiman Barr for his leadership of the Basis Center and for everything he's done in terms of the study of U.S.-Israel relations. I want to thank Johnny Reinhold on his important new book. I'd urge everyone to read it. The fact it was written by someone who wasn't even an American about American domestic politics is quite a feat, and I salute you, Johnny, for that. And I also, my friend David Weinberg, also here at the Basis Center, for all his efforts, and also my colleague Yaakov Amidror. I could just tell you, when people always like to look at things that are looking bleak, I could tell you a personal story that I asked Yaakov Amidror's counterpart, Tom Donilon, who was the National Security Advisor in the first term of the Obama administration, about Yaakov, and he said, Jacob is a man of the highest ethical caliber. And I think it really showed. I mean, we had some very intimate discussions in the U.S.-Israel relationship, and I think it's partly the credibility was not just the immense knowledge of Yaakov Amidror and Tom Donilon, but the fact that they had really a relationship based on trust. And I would not underestimate the importance of that personal dimension, even going along with all the structural points that Yaakov himself made. So thank you very much, Yaakov. Look, this is my first talk in public since I've been in the government in Israel. My first talk in Israel since I've been in the government with the Kerry administration, and in working for Secretary of State Kerry. So there's a lot of things I cannot talk about, and I hope you understand that. But I thought what I should do now, we've heard some really fine academic presentations, is to try to give a policy overview about that would look at what were the premises of the Secretary, as I understood them, going into the government and going into the initiative, and what were the reasons it didn't work, as I see it, at least the part I feel I could talk about, and then where are we going forward, which I know is of interest to an audience such as this. In terms of, what were the premises? This was going to be the most intense involvement of the United States ever in final status issues, what I would call the core five, the borders, the security arrangements, Jerusalem, refugees, and what became a fifth issue. The four were in Oslo itself in the Declaration of Principles, that these would be what we call final status. A fifth one emerged called mutual recognition, which is about the character of both societies. Will each one recognize that one has a character of a nation state of the Jewish people with equal rights for all citizens, and will the Israeli side recognize the same about the Palestinian side? So that became a fifth issue. When I was hired, I said, Secretary wants to do a deal in 9 months. A treaty is going to be the size of the Manhattan phone book. That is a very, that's a high bar, as we would say. But if we could get what we call a framework, which means focus on the 5 for 5, and the Secretary was very committed to the 5 for 5, then that would represent the core conceptual bargain. And then the technicians could come in after that and talk about the details. But if we don't have a concept, we will be lost in a blizzard of a million details. So that was the concept. I would do that again today if there's a decision to do 5 for 5, which I will relate to later. But what were the premises? Premise number one is you had two leaders who said that they both wanted a two-state solution for their own national interest. You had the prime minister who went to the grave of Theodore Herzl and said the status quo is not good for Israel. It's a binational reality. If Israel wants to remain a Jewish state, we have to solve this problem. You had Abbas saying how stagnation was leading to radicalization, that without a deal, Hamas would be able to say Fatah has achieved nothing. And that these were leaders who evinced strength. Netanyahu had been reelected. This was his third term at the time. And Abbas had said something which I think most Israelis that I come across, even the most knowledgeable ones, don't seem to be aware of, that he went up at the UN General Assembly in 2013 and said we have to, quote, end the conflict and end claims. And that's what Israelis have always wanted, and he said that publicly. So in terms of the leaders, that was one dimension. The second dimension was a sense that the rejectionism was in disarray. You know, Hamas was not 10 feet tall. I mean, it sounds like out of a Jay Leno story, but, you know, how bad was it in Syria? It was even too bloody for Hamas, because they were killing Sunnis, so they didn't want to be aligned with Assad. Of course, the Iranians who were aligned with Assad were upset that Hamas wouldn't be aligned with Assad, but Hamas thought, well, we have better shores now because the Muslim Brotherhood is in Cairo. But by the summer of 2013, already there had been a counter-revolution, so to speak, or a counter-revolution, depends how you count, in Egypt, and the Brotherhood was out. And so it was like a triple whammy for Hamas. They lost Syria, they lost Iran, and they lost Egypt. So that was also, you know, one of the premises. I think the third was really the sense that that the region was distracted, that they could not cause mischief because of the Arab Spring. They had their own issues to worry about, and that should at least let the parties negotiate more in peace. I would say a fourth piece of this was that the polling data showed what we all know, that both sides supported a two-state solution, but each side was skeptical that the other side was committed to it. So if there was actually a commitment, there was public support if you could bring that off. And I think, you know, a final piece is that the alternatives didn't look too much better. Yes, this may sound very recent history. Yes, you could go to the ICC, the International Criminal Court. You could try all these boycotts, but this is not going to change Israeli control of the West Bank and not going to have any immediate benefit for any longer time. The Secretary felt strongly that the incrementalism had, instead of being a trust-building, confidence-building measure, a CBM, it exacerbated that trust. So that incrementalism for some had been discredited. I personally may disagree with that. I felt this was now going to be the third time in a row that the United States was really trying the other approach. And I apologize to Israelis by using an American sports metaphor. But whenever you swing for the fences, as you do in the year 2000 at Camp David, 2007 and 2008, the Annapolis process with Condoleezza Rice, Prime Minister Olmert, and President Abbas. And here in 2013, this would be the third time. Now, some people say, well, 3 strikes, you're out. And there was also, I should say, a 3-week effort in 2010 for purists, if you want to be technical about it. But these were all efforts not to go the incremental path. But given what I said above, there was an effort to see, well, let's see if we can do the 5 for 5 and do that core conceptual bargain. And if we could, then we could go, from there. So what was the result? I think there was some good news, and that good news was never told to the publics on both sides, because for some of the publics it wouldn't have been good news. But it meant that we couldn't really build momentum. And here, these things have been said publicly even by, Martin Indyk and others. So, I can't tread on a lot of details, but I would say of the 5 for 5, there were at least 2 of the 5 that were more promising than the public, were told that at the time. In terms of, again, depending on your point of view, of course, but when Martin said publicly, Israel was in the zone of possible agreement, the so-called ZOPA, when it came to territory, and the Palestinians were more flexible on the refugee issues than I would say probably 99% of Israelis would believe. So that gave some hope that there was something here. Now, of course, we have the other 3 issues: Jerusalem, security arrangements, and the Jewish state question or / mutual recognition. But what we saw here was leaders that were very risk averse, and they were, you'd say you're not Prime Minister of Israel for a long time unless you're risk averse, because look how risky the region is. So I'm not here to criticize, but both of them felt that the publics had felt burnt, and the key is don't raise expectations. So if we were hoping to do some what I would call synchronized political messaging, to get each side to reach out to the other side, to get the publics at least somewhat hopeful, we found out this was more like a hermetically sealed laboratory. And we had to accept that. You know, that's what the leaders want, that's what they wanted. But the hermetically sealed laboratory was, we couldn't talk about the progress, because nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And also the synchronized messaging was, you know, we wanted each one to say, you know, reach out to the other side. Maybe Abbas would admit that Israel's taken down a lot of the checkpoints. Doesn't usually admit to that in public. He always says, if I admit something good Israel's done, they'll just put it in their pocket. And the reverse. You know, security cooperation has been depoliticized. I remember the 90s when it was like a light switch. If Arafat wanted it, Rajub and Dahlan would turn it on or turn it off. Now you have a professional level of security cooperation, and many people are alive today because of that security cooperation. But that was not, the leaders didn't want to go that route because they didn't want to raise expectations, because that is politically costly. Another factor that I think clearly, you know, didn't help much was, you know, that, you know, each side did things that were not exactly helpful. And I think it was Yaakov mentioned it about Abbas not getting back to us on our offer to him in March. Tzipi Livni has talked about it publicly as well. There's been American officials that have talked about it as well. That was a key turning point. And clearly signing those conventions, I think 15 of them, during the negotiations are agreeing to some sort of reconciliation government based on technocrats and at the cabinet table, whatever it was not helpful. And you know, I certainly wish we would be public in our sense about that these were not helpful. I think we could have done more anyway. And on the Israeli side, I think there was sometimes on the settlements issue, and Yaakov was in the middle of it, I'm sure he's going to respond to me, where in fact that Israel was more geographically cautious. Was someone in the US government who followed the settlements issue because I had done all these maps, and actually 62% of the, what we call the tenders, the construction bids, were really in the 1.9% of the area that Abbas told Olmert would be Israel anyway. But it would have been helpful if that could be done publicly, because the net effect was most people don't walk around with maps in their head. They don't know. They think, oh, you say you want 2 states and then you build settlements, you must be cheating us. So this became an exacerbating force, but when it wasn't stated publicly, in my view. I'm not equating the two. I'm not equating them, but I think this was an issue. The other thing, though, is the question, though, I think the biggest problem of all was not a result of anything the parties did, but was a result of the region, the Arab Spring, the Arab upheaval, call it whatever you want to call it. And that was that if you read the literature of all the participants, as I did, I think, of all the participants in Camp David 2000, they will all tell you that the security arrangements was the easiest of the issues to resolve. It was technical. It was as Israel stands down, international force stands up. But what happened between 2000 and 2013-14, obviously, was the Arab Spring of 2011 and onward. And that, I think, was the biggest factor in many ways, because you know, you had to avoid a situation that the Americans are playing baseball and the Israelis are playing soccer. That, you know, you could be focusing. We have an amazing general, Allen, who done tremendous work and a great American patriot, very well respected in Israel, focusing more on security zones, and the Israelis are wondering, are the Hashemites going to fall? They're not talking the same language. And I think that was the biggest, in my view, one of the biggest impediments. So where do we go from here? And I would just say that in terms of where we go from here, look, some people say, well, we got a new government, nothing's going to happen, and it's going to be great. And maybe it will be, but I think that people who care, you know, the status quo has its problems too, because Israel doesn't want to live in a binational state, doesn't want a binational reality. And clearly security cooperation is important, and it's premised on the idea of nation building. If there's no nation, no state building, then that's going to suffer too, and that will have an impact as well. So where does that leave us? And I don't think anybody really realistically believes that we're going to just have negotiations where we started where we left off. Given all the changes and the you know, the moves, but you know, the lack of relationship between the leadership, I think that leaves us with really a couple directions. One is the Security Council idea, and I know my colleague, who I have a high respect for, Shmuel Sandler, believes it's done as a linkage issue. I don't think so at all. This administration is very confident that it will win any override on the Iranian sanctions issue, on the Iranian disapproval for Iran. You would need 67 votes. And I would say that it's going to be very hard to get that, even by the biggest proponents and advocates who are critical of the president. I have not met one person who believes that that's within range, and not on the House side either. Now, the Ayatollah could say something, this one could say something, things could change. And I'm not taking a position on that, that's not my topic here, but I don't believe it's a reverse linkage issue at all. I think this administration feels very confident on that next vote. But that argument says, listen, these leaders can't do it. They just can't. We've tried it. So this is now about setting down a marker for the future. Let's set out like an anchor that this will be the terms of reference. This will be the parameters for any negotiation, on the 5 for 5. I think the problem is that that assumes that the politics in both societies will align. But when you overshoot the red lines of both sides, there's also a 50-50 chance, at least, that the parties dig in, even that has impact 5 years from now. So it's a risk if you do that. But some would say that's the only card left. That's one approach. And the second thing, and this is what I'll conclude on, would say, look, incrementalism has been given a bad rap. It's actually, done a lot. You have a proto-Palestinian government in the West Bank as a result of incrementalism. Terrorism is down, security cooperation is up. Let's return to incrementalism with more economic dimension, maybe in terms of, Israel's got 100,000 workers now in from the West Bank. Most Israelis aren't even aware of that. Maybe there'll be more of that. Maybe there'll be more sea areas that are not formally reclassified, that's 60% of the West Bank, that Palestinians will have economic access to improve their life. And maybe there'll be the settlement restraint, which will make clear Israel wasn't really doing much settlement activity on the other side of the barrier. So now it won't anymore either, but it will at least be stated. And this will make sure there's not a situation, yes, there's anti-Semitism in Europe. They'll always want to delegitimize Israel. But on the flame kind of spectrum of 1 to 10, and the anti-Semites might put it at a 3, you don't want to take it to a 10 gratuitously for people to say, oh, you're settling everywhere, you're not serious about 2 states, and having Israel fuel delegitimization. Again, not created, obviously, but through policies unwittingly fuel it. So this is the last piece of that approach that I want to throw out here as a kind of an idea that I think needs work on. I don't claim to be that's finished. Look, there's a lot of people always ask, what are the opportunities? And look at the strategic convergence with the Arab world. I jokingly said Israel's the first Sunni state to be Jewish, or the first Jewish state to be Sunni, too. You could say it either way. That there's a convergence on Iran, on the Muslim Brotherhood, on ISIS. Some might say on Turkey. Some might say on criticizing the United States. Whatever that strategic convergence exists, how do you use that in a way that when it comes to Gaza, for example, that you could somehow take, there's an Iran element there, there's a brotherhood element there. How do you use this strategic convergence into something real? And here I would also build on the stature of Egypt, which is, I think has a lot of credibility historically with the Palestinian Authority. I was just in Cairo earlier this week, and I think is very well respected by this Prime Minister and the Defense Minister as well. How do you use that to have a situation in Gaza that ensures that if you help Gaza, you're not helping Hamas? But here, I would say the Israeli on this final point, that Israel and Egypt, they should be aligned because the Sunni states and Israel don't want to help Hamas. It was remarkable for me and the government to say for 51 days, no matter what the television pictures on Al Jazeera, for the first time, Sunni governments saw Hamas through the prism of Israel as a terror entity. And in the Egyptian government, it's referred to as such, the Izzadin al-Qassam. So I'm just saying there's a lot of convergences here. And what I wonder is there a way to have a plan that would bring the Palestinian Authority back to Gaza, and by working with the Egyptians and really getting a lot of the Sunni support that didn't want to help Hamas during that war, to delegitimize Hamas for its weaponry in Gaza. And because Abbas, I think, might be fearful by going into Gaza, they still have guns. So he might gain leverage economically, but if they still have the guns, Hamas will get the credit. So in summary, I would say the following, that I think I'm looking for a common project that is not in the 5 for 5 category at this time, but is something that could help on the humanitarian side. I think Israel actually has been wanting to deal with the reconstruction of Gaza, but it somehow has got to use the strategic convergence that exists and the credibility of the Egyptians as the leader. They're not just geographically well placed on the border, they have political clout. I think this could be a project for this government, for the United States, for the Palestinian Authority, and for the whole Sunni world. Because if you could have a more stable Gaza, I think then you might be re-entering those final status talks under a much better set of circumstances. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you all very much.